Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is standing in a grocery store in a panic, grabbing anything they can reach off the shelf: bottled water, canned beans, white bread, whatever's left. And here's the hard truth: most of what they're grabbing won't be enough. Not because they're buying the wrong calories, but because survival isn't just about calories. It's about heat, minerals, mobility, morale, and the kind of quiet readiness that most people never think about until it's already too late. In this video, we're going through 12 of the most underrated, overlooked, and underappreciated survival foods, and more importantly, the philosophy behind choosing them. Because knowing what to store is only half the equation. Knowing why changes everything. Stay until the end, because the last category might be the one that saves your sanity more than your life, and that matters more than most people realize. Welcome to Food Decider, where we help you eat smarter no matter what the world throws at you. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and leave us a like. It genuinely helps more people find content like this. Now, let's get into it. Let's start with something that almost nobody puts on their survival food list, because technically it isn't food at all: charcoal. Think about it this way. You've done everything right. You've stocked rice, beans, lentils, canned goods. You've rotated your supply. You feel ready. And then the power goes out, not for a few hours, but for days, maybe a week. Suddenly, that bag of dry rice is just a bag of dry rice. The beans won't cook themselves, and cold bread, eaten in the dark, starts to feel less like survival and more like defeat. This is the paradox most people never think about. Food without fire is just raw material, and yet charcoal, one of the simplest, cheapest, and longest-lasting fuel sources available, almost never makes it onto a preparedness list. Here's why it should. A sealed bag of charcoal, kept dry, can last 5, 10, even more years without degrading. It doesn't rot. It doesn't expire in the traditional sense. And when you need it, all it requires is a spark. From there, you can boil water, cook a full meal, sanitize equipment, and even generate warmth. Dozens of hours of cooking capability sitting quietly in a bag in your garage. There's a story worth thinking about here. A man in Houston during a prolonged power outage. He had food, he had water, but no way to heat either. His neighbor had charcoal. That one difference meant one household was eating warm meals and boiling safe water, while the other was eating crackers in the dark. The boiling pot wasn't just practical, it was a symbol, a signal that said, "We are okay, we can manage, we are not helpless." Preparedness doesn't start with food, it starts with fire. If the grid went down tonight, could you create heat completely independently? That question is worth sitting with. Now, once you have fire, the next question is what you're putting over it, and most survival guides immediately jump to protein and calories, but there's a quiet, boring, unsexy ingredient that should come before almost everything else on your list: iodized salt. Not sea salt, not pink Himalayan, iodized salt. Here's why this matters more than most people realize. Iodine is an essential micronutrient. Your thyroid depends on it to regulate nearly every metabolic function in your body: energy production, temperature regulation, weight, mental clarity. And in a survival scenario, when seafood and fortified foods disappear from your diet, iodine is one of the first micronutrients to vanish with them. The shift happens slowly. You start feeling colder, more fatigued. Your thinking feels slightly foggy. Your metabolism slows. Most people blame stress or age or poor sleep, but the real answer might be sitting right there on the shelf, or rather not sitting there because you switched to sea salt because it sounded healthier. A sealed container of iodized salt lasts for years, costs almost nothing, requires no special storage, and does something no fancy supplement can fully replace in a resource-scarce environment. It keeps your thyroid running. And when your thyroid runs, your body runs. It's not glamorous, it doesn't photograph well, but it belongs in every serious pantry. And speaking of things that photograph terribly and matter enormously, let's talk about unflavored gelatin. Food shortages don't usually kill people through starvation alone. One of the more insidious threats in any prolonged crisis is losing physical mobility, the quiet, creeping deterioration of joints, tendons, and connective tissue that happens when your body stops getting the specific proteins it needs to repair itself. Most protein sources, beans, rice, canned meats, don't provide meaningful amounts of collagen, and collagen is what your cartilage, ligaments, and tendons are made of. Without regular intake, especially under physical stress, those tissues degrade, slowly, painfully, and in ways that don't show up until they already limit you. Unflavored gelatin is one of the few concentrated sources of collagen-building amino acids that's shelf-stable, lightweight, inexpensive, and easy to incorporate into almost any meal. About 6 grams per serving dissolves into hot liquid, soup, broth, whatever you're already making. You don't taste it, you don't notice it, but over weeks and months of physical labor, carrying water, chopping wood, managing stress, your joints.
There's a real consideration here for anyone over 50. A man in his early 60s, otherwise healthy and reasonably prepared, discovered during a multi-day power outage that his biggest limitation wasn't food or water, it was his knees. Carrying supplies, going up and down stairs, doing the physical work that survival quietly demands, his joints were the bottleneck. Calories couldn't fix that. Preparedness isn't theoretical. Your body has to be able to execute the plan. Gelatin is one of the quietest ways to support that. Now let's talk about something that almost guarantees you'll find supplies when everyone else can't. Sardines. In virtually every supply disruption, documented or anecdotal, the pattern is the same. Tuna disappears first, canned chicken disappears, Spam disappears, Vienna sausages disappear, and sardines sit on the shelf. Not because they're inferior, because most people don't like them or think they don't. And in a survival context, that unpopularity is one of their greatest strengths. Here's what a single can of sardines actually contains: around 20 grams of complete protein, significant omega-3 fatty acids, which support brain function, reduce inflammation, and become increasingly rare when fresh food disappears. Vitamin D, which most people are already deficient in, and which becomes nearly impossible to source without sunlight or fortified food. Calcium from the small edible bones, providing meaningful bone support, and iodine, circling back to that thyroid function we already talked about. Sardines don't require cooking, they don't require water, they don't require refrigeration, they have a long shelf life, and they provide a more complete nutritional profile per ounce than almost any other canned protein available. The strategy here isn't just nutritional, it's social. When the shelves empty, sardines remain. Learn to eat them now before you need to. Mash them into rice, mix them with vinegar and herbs, use them as a base for simple soups. The people who figured this out early aren't hunting for supplies when things get hard. They're eating well. Now, if sardines represent the short to medium term strategy, the next food represents something else entirely, a commitment to preparation that goes beyond weeks or months and starts thinking in decades. Whole wheat berries. Not whole wheat flour, the whole intact kernel. Here's the distinction, and it matters. When wheat is ground into flour, the oils inside the kernel are exposed to air. Oxidation begins. Within months, sometimes weeks, that flour starts degrading, losing nutritional value, eventually going rancid. That's why flour on your shelf has a relatively short useful life, even in sealed conditions. The intact wheat berry is completely different. The hard outer bran layer acts as a natural seal, protecting the germ and the oils inside from air and moisture. Stored correctly, sealed containers, oxygen absorbers, cool and dry conditions, wheat berries can remain viable for 25 to 30 years, sometimes longer. But the longevity isn't even the most remarkable part. A wheat berry is not just food, it's raw material. You can grind it into fresh flour and bake bread. You can sprout it and produce living, nutrient-dense greens in days. In a genuine long-term scenario, you can plant it and grow more. It is, in a very real sense, a seed, a food source that can perpetuate itself. Most people plan for weeks, some plan for months, very few plan for years. Even fewer think about what food security looks like a decade from now. Wheat berries are for those people, the ones who are thinking not just about the next crisis, but about true generational resilience. And while we're talking about foods built for the long game, dried chickpeas deserve to be in the same conversation. 20 to 30 years. That's the realistic shelf life of properly stored dried chickpeas. And unlike wheat berries, which require milling or sprouting to be most useful, chickpeas are immediately versatile in ways that keep meals interesting even when ingredients are limited. Cook them whole in a stew, roast them with salt for a protein-dense snack, grind them into flour for flatbreads, fritters, and savory pancakes, blend them into soup, mash them into a rough hummus with a little vinegar and oil. One ingredient, prepared 5 different ways, tastes like 5 different meals. And in a situation where food monotony becomes a real psychological burden, which it does faster than most people expect, that versatility is not a luxury. It is a survival tool. One family who documented a 45-day pantry challenge reported that chickpeas were the single ingredient that kept their meals feeling like meals, not just fuel, but food, the kind with texture and variation and enough adaptability that they never felt like they were eating survival rations, even when they technically were. Which brings us to something that doesn't get nearly enough credit in survival nutrition: fat. Not fat as a fear, fat as fuel. Duck fat, lard, rendered animal fat properly sealed. These are among the most energy-dense foods you can store, over 120 calories per tablespoon from a source that stores well without refrigeration for 1 to 3 years when handled correctly, and potentially much longer in cooler conditions. Here's what most calorie-focused survival strategies miss. In a real crisis, your energy demands go up.
Physical labor, disrupted sleep, stress, cold temperatures, all of these increase your caloric needs at exactly the moment when your food supply is constrained. Carbohydrates help, but they burn fast. Fat sustains. It's slower burning, more calorie-dense per gram, and provides the kind of lasting energy that lets you work, think, and endure. Beyond raw energy, fat transforms food. A spoonful of duck fat in a pot of plain rice and beans turns something monotonous into something satisfying. It carries flavor, creates richness, and signals to your brain that you have eaten a real meal, not just consumed calories. That signal matters more than most nutrition science acknowledges. Fat is not the enemy. In a survival context, it might be one of your most valuable allies. There's a dimension of survival preparedness that almost no one talks about openly because it sounds soft. It sounds like a luxury concern. And that dimension is this: what happens to your mind when your diet collapses? Because it does collapse, abruptly, completely, and in ways that have real physiological consequences, not just psychological ones. When your normal food environment disappears and you're suddenly eating a narrow, repetitive diet of shelf-stable staples, the first system to struggle is usually your gut. And the gut, increasingly understood by science, is not just a digestive organ. It's a communication system. It produces neurotransmitters, it regulates immune response, and sends signals that directly influence mood, stress tolerance, and cognitive function. Miso paste addresses this in a way that almost nothing else on a survival shelf can. Miso is a fermented paste, traditionally soybeans, salt, and a culture called koji, and it carries living probiotic organisms that help stabilize and diversify gut bacteria. When your diet changes suddenly, that microbial diversity is one of the first things to erode. Miso helps maintain it. A single container provides dozens of servings. Dissolved in hot water, it becomes a simple, deeply satisfying soup. Combined with a handful of dried mushrooms, seaweed, or even just plain noodles, it becomes a meal with genuine depth. It lasts for months without refrigeration, longer with it. And it works quietly from the inside, maintaining the internal balance that makes stress more manageable and nutrition more effective. Gut stability is invisible. You don't feel it working until it stops working. Think of miso as insurance for your internal environment. Nutritional yeast works in a similar direction, but from a completely different angle. Most people confuse it with baking yeast. It isn't. Nutritional yeast is deactivated. It doesn't leaven anything. What it does is provide a remarkably dense concentration of B vitamins, including B12 in many fortified varieties, which becomes critically important when animal products and dairy, the primary dietary sources of B12, disappear from your plate. B vitamins are involved in nearly every energy-producing reaction in the human body. B12 specifically governs red blood cell production and neurological function. A deficiency doesn't announce itself immediately. It creeps in over weeks. Fatigue that doesn't respond to rest, difficulty concentrating, emotional instability, pins and needles in the extremities. By the time these symptoms are obvious, the deficiency is already significant. Nutritional yeast lasts 2 to 3 years sealed, requires no refrigeration, and has a slightly cheesy, savory flavor that actually makes plain food taste better. Sprinkle it on rice, stir it into soup, add it to anything bland, and watch the palatability improve. It is, in the most literal sense, a mood food, one that works at the cellular level. And since we're talking about things that work on morale and spirit, let's talk about dried mushrooms, because their value goes far beyond nutrition. 1 pound of dried mushrooms, when rehydrated, yields somewhere between 7 and 8 pounds of volume. They contain vitamin D, selenium, and crucially, umami, that deep, savory, satisfying flavor that tells your brain you've eaten something real, something complete. This might sound trivial until you've eaten plain rice and beans for the 5th day in a row. At that point, the absence of flavor doesn't just make meals less enjoyable, it makes them demoralizing. Food becomes a chore instead of a ritual. And when meals stop feeling like meals, something important in human psychology starts to erode. There's an account of a woman who fed her family during a prolonged period of financial hardship almost entirely on rice, beans, and dried mushrooms. The mushrooms, she said, were what made the difference, not nutritionally, but emotionally. Rehydrating them was a ritual. The soaking liquid became a rich broth. The meal smelt like something worth eating. Her family sat down to dinner and felt, despite everything, that they were okay. That feeling, that specific sense of normalcy around a meal, is not a small thing. It is one of the central pillars of human resilience. Vinegar plays a related role, though its utility is more practical. White vinegar, apple cider vinegar, rice vinegar, each has its place. White vinegar is aggressive, stable, and powerful. It disinfects surfaces, neutralizes odors, and preserves vegetables through pickling in a way that extends your effective food variety almost. When refrigeration is gone and fresh produce disappears, pickled vegetables become one of the few ways to maintain variety, crunch, and micronutrient diversity in your diet. Apple cider and rice vinegar bring nuance, softer acidity, depth of flavor, the kind of brightness that lifts a dull dish into something worth eating. Vinegar doesn't expire in any meaningful sense. It sits on the shelf, patient and unbothered, waiting for the moment when it transforms a pot of plain food into something with flavor, life, and character. It is a quiet force multiplier, invisible in abundance, invaluable in scarcity. And then there is the last item on this list, the one that might seem the most trivial, the most easily dismissed, but which might matter more to the human spirit than almost anything else we've discussed. Cream of tartar. Here's the scenario. It's been 3 weeks. You have flour, salt, and water. The familiar rhythms of your kitchen are long gone, but you want bread. Not crackers, not flat bread so dense it sits in your stomach like a stone. Real, soft, risen bread. The kind that fills the air with a smell that says home. Baking yeast is gone, but cream of tartar combined with baking soda in the right ratio functions as a homemade baking powder. It releases carbon dioxide when it meets moisture and heat, creating lift, softness, and the kind of texture that turns flour and water into something recognizable as food, rather than just sustenance. Stored dry and sealed, cream of tartar lasts for years without degrading. It takes up almost no space. It costs almost nothing. And what it provides is not calories or vitamins or minerals. It provides normalcy, the act of baking, the ritual of mixing and shaping and waiting, the smell of something warm coming from the oven or the improvised equivalent. the way a child's face changes when they see something that looks like the food they recognize from before. These rituals are not distractions from survival. They are survival of the human part of us that needs more than calories to remain intact. The ability to bake a warm loaf during instability is worth more than its weight in any nutrient we can measure. So here's the thing about everything we've talked about today. None of it is glamorous. None of it makes for a particularly impressive photograph. No one is going to look at your shelf of charcoal, iodized salt, gelatin, sardines, wheat berries, chickpeas, duck fat, miso, nutritional yeast, dried mushrooms, vinegar, and cream of tartar and think, wow, that's exciting. But that's the point. True preparedness was never meant to be exciting. It was meant to be effective, quiet, deliberate, built not on fear, but on thinking carefully and honestly about what the body needs, what the mind needs, and what the spirit needs to keep going when ordinary life is no longer available. The people who navigate crises best are almost never the ones with the most dramatic stockpiles. They're the ones who stayed calm, adapted, and had exactly what they needed, even the things they didn't know they'd need until they did. That calm is not an accident, it's a practice, and it starts in the pantry. If this video gave you something to think about, leave us a comment with the one item you're adding to your list first. We read every one. And if you're not subscribed to Food Decider yet, now is a good time. We'll see you in the next one.